I'm Chloé Morin, I'm a specialist in politics. I'm supposed to speak about how to go beyond communitarianism, and then I will give the floor to the moderator, Séverin HUSSON. What would be a definition of communitarianism? That's the temptation to be on oneself in some historical events, with each individual having their own roads, own codes, own rules, own religions. Sometimes they compete with the values of the Republic. That can be sometimes a reflex in times of difficulties. However, communitarianism is often seen as refusing, rejecting others, and that could lead to fights and combats. Should we talk about drifts or revolutions? This phenomenon has been seen on the other side of the Atlantic. The melting pot was supposed to have the acceptance of different entities, to have a salad bowl, and to be far away from the ideas of the United States that actually led to its genesis. In France, the President Jacques Chirac was the first one to phrase it on the 29th of January 1998, more than a quarter of a century ago in Mulhouse, on Alsace joining France. He said, France is not and never will be a mosaic of communities living with one another, communities that would face one another, fight against one another. Communitarianism has no space in France and should not exist. He saw signs of weaknesses in communitarianism. He saw that it could have an impact on social pact. Some reject it because they think that that's a negation of our republican ideas. Others think that that's the only way to make the voice of minorities heard that feel rejected. So our session would be dedicated to wondering if we should worry about this phenomenon and how we should respond to it with public policies, culture, affirmative action, representation of diversity, for instance. I'll give you the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chloé. There's a lot of things in which you have said, Chloé Morin, especially the evolution in the US, going from the dream of a melting pot to a salad bowl. We'll see whether this evolution is duplicated in our old Europe, in the old continent. And we'll try to look into solutions, into tools that we might have. Before introducing the guests, I would like to say a few words on this concept of communitarianism. It could be a trap. As Chirac has been mentioned, I will mention Emmanuel Macron. When he wanted to address this phenomenon in 2021, he decided not to call the law communitarianism, but rather law on separatism. It is actually, it has negative connotations. There's a matter of wanting to belong legitimately to a community, and communitarism is claims of new rights, new political organization. That's where the rubber hits the road here. We need to draw the line between belonging to a community and the problem of communitarianism. My name is Séverin HUSSON. I'm a journalist at La Croix. 10 seconds of self-promotion. The website of lacroix.com is in free access until Tuesday. If you don't know us, or if you don't know us very well, do not hesitate to access the to check out the website. It is free until Tuesday. So we have wonderful guests to answer these complicated questions. We have an international panel, so we can have an outlook from and insights from outside. We have Bintou TRAORÉ. Bintou TRAORÉ, you are an African feminist from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. You're also a journalist. You've done so many things. You created the Ivorian League of the Rights of Women, and you'll give us your input on the status of African women. Christophe LERIBAULT, you're the president of the Versailles Castle. You have been at the Villa de Médicis. You've worked for the Louvre museums. You have so many background experiences, and you're going to talk about culture. Maybe culture can be a way to appease things. Then we have Tabatha. You have the president of CCIB. You are CEO of a Canadian partnership for indigenous populations. Maybe you can talk about it. And you have been the CEO of the year, appointed by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And you're amongst the 100 lobbyists that are most influential in Canada, and you have been appointed so for many years now. And next to you, there's Christopher CALDWELL. You are an American journalist. You've been working for the most prestigious English-speaking reviews and magazines like the Financial Times, or you have worked, or you're working. And there's a book that you published earlier, which resonates to our roundtable in 2011, A Revolution Under Our Eyes, How Islam is going to Change France and Europe. We'll start with you, Christopher CALDWELL. This topic of salad bowl, multiculturalism, would you agree to that word? Would you make it your own? Can you give us background context on the evolution of the U.S. from the melting pot to the salad bowl evolution? I don't like this word multiculturalism, indeed, because it's a complex story, but multiculturalism has a long history, which is more due to political reasons than cultural reasons. That goes back to civic rights in the 60s when they were defended. What I thought was very interesting is what Chloé just said. I was in France in the 90s. She's talking about Jacques Chirac and so on. And at that time, during cohabitation between, we had Chirac and Jospin at the time, and I remember I went to Place Beauvau when Jean-Pierre Chevènement was the minister there, and I talked to a deputy on immigrations from Muslims, and I asked, what about affirmative action, positive discrimination? And he said, well, it seems that you don't understand the constitutional system of France. For us, it is impossible. It does not exist, that type of communitarianism. But this is where we stand now. I won't speak too much at length on your politics because this is not my country. However, I would like to talk about the situation in the U.S. The U.S., in a certain way, has invented these concepts. We have a long history where we've tried to manage diversity starting from our Civil War during the 19th century. And after the Civil War, we've had important, complex issues to address. It was not enough to abolish slavery, but also we need to include people that were freed. We needed to create a more inclusive society. So we did have a lot of successes, but also a lot of failures. We've had segregation for a long time. In the 60s, we've had civic rights laws. In the 70s, in more ways than one, something that was very important. We've created a corpus of case law on the subject matter of how we could do inclusion, we could foster inclusion. So we have pursued this long-term policy, unlike other countries in Europe. France is an exception. It stands out partially on that subject. What I would like to point out today, this issue is full of contradictions. We've talked about promoting inclusion, to how to combat exclusion, how to promote diversity. But in many ways, most instances actually, these goals are very admirable, very laudable per se on their own, but they often contradict one another. They would build diversity. That's actually contradictory. Diversity and inclusion can be antagonizing, and we can actually delve into that later. Thank you. That's an interesting path of thought. Indeed, inclusion and diversity can actually antagonize one another. Chloé. Tabatha, how can we foster inclusion of different communities? You come from the first Canadian nations. What have you set up within your Canadian Council for Indigenous Populations, CCAB? What do you do to include minorities?
The opportunity to be here and to share in learnings with all of you. It's a pleasure to participate in an event. I was saying earlier, it's a pleasure to participate in an event that not only looks at economics, but also considers important facets of poverty, trust, society, diversity, and community. And as a female First Nation engineer, I suppose I tick a lot of boxes, but I don't always have a loud voice or an opportunity to use my voice. So I appreciate all of you being here. You know, the role of companies as agents of diversity and inclusion is pivotal and necessary conversation, particularly when we consider not only the unique and enhanced impact of our key concerns, such as climate change, the widening social economic gaps, and scarcity of resources on those communities that have been excluded and colonized. And don't forget the opportunity that including these communities also already presents. And this is the work that we do. In a world shaped by interconnected economies and diverse societies, the imperative for companies to champion diversity and foster inclusivity has never been more pronounced. But I want to take a note about being cautious about the general use of terms in this space. Every community who seeks equity and is deserved inclusion has their own unique perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds beyond the demographics of race, gender, and age. Before we speak about inclusivity, those unique histories must be learned, understood, respected, and in some instances, like Canada with Indigenous people, atoned for. Inclusion, on the other hand, ensures that all individuals feel valued, respected, and empowered to contribute fully to their organization's success. And we must not forget the difference between equity and equality. Treating everyone as equal is not the same as providing equitable opportunities. From an economic perspective, we must come to an understanding that those unique perspectives enrich organizational culture and drive innovation. Research consistently demonstrates that companies with diverse and inclusive workplaces and teams are more innovative, adaptable, and capable of outperforming their competitors. I have much to say on the need for support, inclusion, and dismantling of structures that hold women back from not only thriving, but bringing their incredible emotional and measured intelligence to the economy. But I'll provide a few examples specifically on the unique perspectives of Indigenous communities in Canada. While I am a proud Canadian, I am also a First Nation person in a country which has an does not have an incredible reputation or history with Indigenous people. In fact, it was illegal for Indigenous people to sell goods, to participate in the economy. If we obtained a post-secondary degree, we had to be removed from our communities. And despite those historical injustices, we have persisted. Indigenous people make up 5% of the population of Canada, and we are the fastest growing population. We are creating businesses at 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses, currently close to 70,000 Indigenous businesses. We've heard many times that economies thrive when all segments of society are actively engaged and given equal opportunities to participate and succeed. In Canada, business must play a crucial role in fostering this growth by actively engaging with Indigenous communities. At CCIB, we have a certification program called PAIR that enables organizations to set goals and measure against those goals in how they work with Indigenous peoples, communities, and businesses. This is not about corporate philanthropy and token gestures. It's about embedding thinking about how an organization can build relationships through inclusion. And this matters to consumers, to employees, and to shareholders. The companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange that are certified in this program outperformed the broader market by 80 basis points on an annualized basis. We've also seen strong benefits and partnerships, from fisheries to pipelines to energy projects. Indigenous ownership is bringing project certainty, sustainability, long-term partnerships, and reliable employment to corporations and projects for the benefit of both partners. Embracing diversity and inclusion is not just a moral imperative. It's a strategic business decision that drives long-term sustainability and growth. By fostering inclusive workplaces, companies attract top talent, bolster their reputation as responsible corporate businesses, and bring innovative practices and stability to projects. As leaders, we play a pivotal role in shaping policies and practices that promote economic prosperity. Remember that you, have a voice at tables that many communities are not invited to. By advocating for and conducting research that underscores the economic benefits of inclusion, diversity, and support of communities' economic development, you can drive meaningful change within public and private sectors. Miigwech.
Merci. Peut-être Christophe Leribault.
Thank you, Christophe Leribault. Maybe you want to react to what has been said, and as a representative of as a French citizen, would you like to defend the universalism and our universal traditions? Why should we keep this universal momentum? I'm talking from Versailles, which requires that we go back to the 18th century. We'll be a bit corporate here, because when facing communitarianism, which was very strong in a Europe that was very much scattered out with provinces, with a society with a strong hierarchy, with nobility, with clergy and so on. I'm not going to repeat history, but it was a situation that was very particular, with a lot of social chunks here and there. And with the century of lights, we wanted to bring enlightenment. Namely, we wanted to share resources beyond communities, beyond these groups. And that's because of traveling. There was also, due to exotism, sometimes it was stereotypes, of course, but it's also the rights of humankind and citizens. That was what was defended with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was defended, but it could also be seen as something that is specific to the old Europe. And maybe it was also, it gave rise to imperialism, because we thought at the time that we needed to give a voice and to disseminate those values that we thought were superior. And we should maybe be cautious about this use of these values that was the outcome of a long process of maturation in Europe, because it was so fragmented at the time. These philosophers wanted to find a solution to get out of this. We have always been at the crossroads in Europe of different trends, So we wanted to create value, to have social cohesion, to go beyond this overlapping of values. I'm defending my parts, so museums and culture. I think that museums offer a representation of the world, different worlds, from a geographic point of view, but also throughout time, because all eras are represented. And we can discover and meet others. First of all, we are in awe of works of art, of course. There are codes in museums. Not everyone goes to museum, but we try to get out of this to attract as many people. As far as I'm concerned, there's not a shock of culture, a clash of cultures, but rather a clash of those that do not have cultures. Even if we're right in wanting to be proud of our origins, we should look at what the others do. In Versailles and in museums and in the world of culture, we do as much as we can to attract the young people and everything. The aim is not only to defend Louis XIV. That wouldn't work, actually, for foreigners. What we want to do is to create a think tank of talents with gardens, with architects, with landscape gardens, with fountain experts, musicians, and they could be Italian, German, French carpenters. And actually, the kings were multicultural because of their of their ancestors, coming from the Bourbon, for instance. And you also have the Jeu de Paume room, the ancestor of tennis, and where there was a Congress room. The Senate and the National Assembly could vote for an amendment to the Constitution quite unanimously. It was only 4 months ago. It's hard to think that. But this is a venue, Versailles, which is a place of wonder. We have to, and that instills trust in the diversity of the world. We can be very proud to have museums that are dedicated to such and such civilizations, to find oneself, but also to open it up to the others and to make experiments as to this diversity. So we go from a universalism that is too much, that has a facet of conquerors that is maybe to be dropped out, but it is the starting point of finding a way to find each other, all of us together again. Thank you, Christophe. Maybe that can resonate to what you're going to tell us, Mrs. Bintou Traoré. Can you explain to us how the taking on board of specific identity or identities of differences can help us reconcile communities? And maybe we should illustrate this with what could be done at the level of press coverage. Thank you. I come from the Côte d'Ivoire, and I'm a communitarist. I like to spend time with people that look like me, with my relatives, with those that have the same culture. And that makes me feel well and good. When I understood that I wanted to like what I was, that enabled me to go towards the others. I traveled, I studied in France, I studied at the Higher School of Journalism in Paris. And I found it easier to include myself, to integrate myself, because if I hadn't accepted who I was, I couldn't integrate in the world with other people. These two words are indeed not irreconcilable. They can be compatible. We can have differences, and we can go beyond these differences. We can have a society fraught with social cohesion. We have to respect, of course, the law of the country. We shouldn't rub off differences. As said earlier, and I agree with what was said, universalism of the past century, and you've talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it didn't include women, actually, at the time. We needed some time before women could actually be included in the Universal Declaration of humans. It should be also men and women. And also, regarding universalism, they tried to show, and the question that I wonder about that subject, what are the values that are conveyed? Is that a consensus? Because we are in a world that is a globalized world, and we need to open the debate, to open the debate and think about what we mean by universalism. We're not it's not the 19th century anymore. A lot of things have happened since then. I work in the media world. Before, I was in front of the camera. Now I'm behind the camera. And I thought it was very important to show my perception of the world instead of blaming everyone, saying that people that I don't like are in front of the camera. I thought, okay, I should actually take the bull by the horns and do something about it so that we don't have stereotypes. I'm not saying that everything that is showed is all linked to racism. It's not true. And we are evolving in the media. We have a plurality of medias with different angles and different mindsets. And we can have different representations with a faithful representation of Black people, Arab people, white people. And I think it's a good way, it's a good thing, because regarding perception and the way people and information can be processed, I think that human beings are sacred, and we should have freedom of speech. And medias need to go towards diversity. In France, nowadays, we have a culture, we have traditions, values, and identity. But it is actually an identity that is full of a variety of identities, and this is what we should show.
If we could ponder a little bit about the question of the media, because the situation is completely different in the United States and in Canada. So, Tabatha Bull, could you perhaps say a couple of words about how the media can play a role in smoothing out these differences and in finding reconciliation between the communities?
Sure, thank you. You know, in Canada, we've had, as I said, the history with Indigenous people is really coming to light for a number of people. More recently, there was confirmation of graves at what were called residential schools. And at that time, the media wanted to tell that story. But it's a difficult story to tell. It took up a lot of media space, and it really started to open up a conversation. That is continuing to happen, but the media has moved on to other things. And I think also, you know, there are stereotypes that the media, you know, seems to be stories that are picked up and are, you know, perhaps that gets more stories or more readers. And that's about that Indigenous people are anti-infrastructure or anti-build, and that's really not the case. It's a better story to tell, to see blockades of pipelines and blockades of building, but there are a number of communities that are partnering on infrastructure projects that want to be part of that economic build. And too often we see the media tell the story that gets the bigger tell or the bigger space versus really celebrating that Indigenous excellence and partnership. So it does put us into that stereotype of being anti-development when that's really not the case.
Merci. Christopher CALDWELL, passons à un autre.
Christopher CALDWELL, perhaps let's move on to another participant in this equation. What about the state? When we were preparing our meeting, you were saying that in some American states, when communities which used to be majority became a minority, that could cause chaos. Would you like to give us a little more information about that and come back on the policies that can be implemented by the state? Yes, as I said, I think there are quite a few paradoxes here. I was struck by what Tabatha was saying a few moments ago. on the subject of that real difference that is involved in diversity. Universalism involves equality. It's difficult to put into practice, but the principle is of the law. We have laws about equality, etc. There are communities that are very specific, that have their own unique characteristics. And a state has to treat these people differently. The German government owes a debt to the Jews in a different way that it owes a debt to gays or to immigrants or anybody else. It's really easy to kind of get muddled up when you're looking at differences between historical duties, such as the United States have to their population of color. And there's a basic duty of equality there. So in my country, we have created laws to make up for certain injustices in the 1960s. This is unique to the United States. However, by doing that, we created a new government system that was very useful for managing several rights issues. The rights of homosexuals, for women, for those who speak a different language. So one might wonder whether it's legitimate to use a system of laws which are created for some historical emergency. And is it fair to use them to ends that are not linked to historical guilt? There is an impression, a growing impression, that these systems are overused to ends for which they were not created. And that creates complications in the states, where there was a former majority. In California, for example, where the former majority has become a minority. And they are starting to claim and demand protection of their own interests, such as in the language of civic rights. Are you talking about the Spanish-speaking population there for California? Yes, but there are other immigrants as well, other immigrant communities in California. The whites in California are now a minority, and non-Spanish-speaking whites I'm referring to. So, Christophe LERIBAULT from Versailles, would you like to react to that and to the policy which may be implemented on this front? You've talked about universalism and the role of culture. Do you want to react to what Christopher Caldwell's just said? Well, in the United States, there are a lot of combats for communities, for reasons of identity and all the rest. There are 1,000 different combats which are possible, which have made progress and taken steps forward, but we can caricature some of this, which in France, for example, we're going through it right now for political reasons, possibly because these steps forward have been highlighted and showcased and immediate rather than being gradual. And there's swings and balances here, and the seesaw might tip up again. There are different people involved, but the main thing is to explain how complex the world is, how complex things are. Nothing is simple. Everything is a question of construction. Being a militant is a great thing, but it involves taking risks. Sometimes it can be a role that comes down to culture or education or media or politicians to explain how we've got to this point, how we can fine-tune things, how we can take things forward by explaining to everyone so that they all become aware, so that we all become aware of how deeply complicated things are. And I think we've come too far in the media, in social media and the media in general. Either you're for something or against something, it's black or it's white. But you have to understand, you have to grasp the contours of it all. Let's not all just stand firmly entrenched in our own certitudes. We seem to lack a kind of depth of analysis. Well, thank you very much. We can now open up the floor for questions. We are trying to not talk about the political situation here in France. It's a bit of a hot topic, and of course it is tied in with the question we're addressing today. So let's not be political in this debate, but we're opening up the floor to questions. Perhaps we can take a microphone to the person who would like to ask a question. On the front row, we've got a person. Yeah, indeed. Here in France, we're going through dark times. It's a time of regression, and it's very costly in terms of society and economics as well. And it means that we have to address an urgent situation. Today, the emergency is perhaps once the elections are over, we need to promote a ministry for integration that could be founded on the coexistence of different cultures, so that we could drive forward policies for education, to intervene in the media and also in businesses as well. So that's a comment rather than a question. We had a Ministry of National Identity a while ago, and you're suggesting a Ministry for Integration this time. So that's another avenue to be explored. So does such a type of ministry exist in Canada or in the States or in Côte d'Ivoire? No, in Côte d'Ivoire we don't need that because we're all rather homogenous. There's less cultural diversity than here, given our history and everything. In Canada, do you need such a ministry?
So we have a ministry focused on Indigenous people. Unfortunately, the history of that was actually about assimilation, so really universalism and removing all of the culture. And now that ministry is really there to help support Indigenous communities in recognizing the culture and the benefits. That ministry also does look at policy around economic development for communities. But then we have a separate ministry that's focused on women, so a ministry really specific to gender issues and women, and any policy that goes through in the government of Canada initially goes through a gender analysis and also an analysis around Indigenous people to understand the benefit that that policy will have to gender specifically, and also looking at Indigenous people. So there are ministries there. We still have a lot of work to do to ensure that the people that those policies are affecting are at the table when the policies are developed and not afterwards. There's work to be done there, but the ministries do exist.
Oui, aux États-Unis, nous n'avons.
In the United States, we don't have a ministry for integration. However, integration is deeply anchored in our national character, our national personality. We don't have your universalism, however. In theory, it would be possible to establish a community with a different language or with a different religion, because very few people have changed. We've got a lot of integration, a lot of assimilation, but very few people have changed their religion when they've arrived in the States. So things happen a little bit differently in the States. We do not have such ministries, but we have not felt the need for such ministries. Thank you very much. Yes, there's a lady there who'd like to ask a question. So I would like to know what kind of compensation was given by the government to the black population. Germany gave money to Jewish people, or to the Jewish community. And in France at the beginning of the 90s, and I'm witness to that, that was the case of my family, it was the same case in France as in Germany. So what did you do in the States? Well, what did we do in the States to make up for past situations? Well, the worst case of all was those civic laws of 1964. And we, in fact, took it to the courts. We used the legal system. And that meant that people could lodge official complaints against private companies that would recruit in a discriminatory way. Or you could lodge a complaint against a public authority that was demonstrating some kind of unfair behavior. We spent a lot of money doing that, but it wasn't really targeted in terms of community or identity. In fact, never. That was never the case. However, these laws went hand in hand with another program, which was called the Great Society, which is an umbrella name for many, many programs. It involved building apartments, and it involved the welfare state for food, money. But a lot of money was loaned out. Some say that tens of trillions of dollars were lent out. But the target was never in function of ethnic identity or community. So perhaps I could ask Tabatha, in Canada, you've got your First Nation. Did you have that kind of help for your First Nations in Canada?
Yeah, so in Canada, there's a number of different ways. So first, the rights of Indigenous people are enshrined in our Constitution. So for example, if a business is developing or doing resource extraction, they are legally required to work with the community that they're impacting. There have been many times that that has not happened in the past, and that has gone into the courts, and there have been settlements. Many First Nation communities also have treaties with the government that were signed. The treaty that I belong to is called Robinson-Huron Treaty. We had a signatory with the government, and that meant that we were to be compensated for the resource extracted from our land, and we were able to continue to hunt and fish within that land. That treaty settlement payment was supposed to be increased every year since 1860, and it was not. So we're actually going through a settlement process right now, 30 communities that belong to that treaty, with the federal government for a payment to ensure that that moves on. And that could mean up to, again, billions of dollars that will be paid in settlement for past wrongs that have happened. And there are a number of those type of land claim settlements that are also happening where land was taken from communities without any payment or retribution. So there are land claim settlements that are happening also. And then one of the most recent settlements is for the residential school survivors, the children that went to residential school or were taken and not come home. There has been monetary settlements to those individuals as well.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a une question? Oui, madame.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Another question. Thank you very much for this really interesting conversation and debate. I've got two questions. My first is from Mr. Caldwell about the Florida situation. I wrote the biography of the person in question. The CIA is involved in the debate. And a question also for Chloé. Do you think that communitarianism and economics can live side by side? Well, I would say that the backlash against the PDI was very, very strong. However, as I also said, let's take the Trump vote. We didn't really explain what the program was until after 2020. However, there was a DEI culture even back in 2016. So there was a very strong backlash. However, as I said earlier on, I believe that multiculturalism is more a legal thing than a cultural thing. And all of the DEI mechanisms are still in place. We've talked about changes in society where the majority group becomes a minority group. Over years, as years have gone by, we've seen several programs of these becoming more ambitious. For example, positive discrimination. These programs remain in place. There's a lot of contestation, but not too much change in terms of the programs. And the second question? I believe that communitarianism can also be seen, as I said earlier on, as a protective mechanism. It can be for cultural protection or protection against economic insecurity. And the fact of being tethered to a community in an economy which is increasingly difficult and brutal and unstable, with rules that you don't understand necessarily. I'm talking about delocalization, for example, mechanisms which are suffered as something which is very brutal by many people in the population. So I think communitarianism can be considered as a shock absorber, and it can gain recognition for the individual, recognition that the individual is not finding elsewhere in the economic world. What strikes me is that policies to promote diversity and inclusion are policies that businesses embrace, and I think they embrace them more strongly than the state does. That's the case in France, particularly for international companies, with programs that can be quite far-reaching. And one might say that liberalism can rise to this challenge of diversity and inclusion. I'm not sure in a more effective way, but at least it's quicker and it's more agile. So yes, Bintou, you'd like to come back on that. Well, what I think is that we can get beyond communitarianism and go towards universalism. But to do that, we need to all talk together. Universalism cannot be imposed upon people. You need to have horizontal relationships, not vertical. You have to open a dialogue. And I think since the beginning of time, there has been time to talk. We've talked about the Human Rights Declaration and the Women's Rights Declaration. We had a charter in Mali, for example, in Africa, this was the first time that Africans sat down around the table to have a shared charter which had the values of democracy, gender equality, and fair laws. So I think we've always been able to talk about how we can act in different places, whether in Asia, Europe, Africa, so that we can have shared values, universal values. We can always do better. I think today, what with globalization and with access to information and with new technologies, I think we really are in a position to be able to determine what we want as universalism, what kind we want. And we can declare that there are certain values that are just we cannot be debated. You must never harm your neighbor, you mustn't kill, you mustn't steal, you mustn't hurt anybody or anything. These are values, I think, which everyone should be able to agree about. They're horizontal. We need to have this universalism which is on a horizontal basis, not a vertical basis which is imposed and thrust upon everybody. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're not going to have time for the final questions. Apologies to those people who've raised their hands. I would just like to specify, before I hand over to Chloé for the conclusion, that Douglas Kennedy is coming here to do a masterclass on this book here. It's called, you can see it on the screen there, C'est ainsi que nous vivons. If you want to see him, and you can stay in the tent afterwards. However, let's get back to Chloé. Yes, there are a lot of differences between the French model and the models in the English-speaking world. And that is why we've had such a rich conversation. We've been able to identify the different limits, etc. And I have started to think more carefully about opposing the goals of diversity and the goals of inclusion, the fact that they can, in fact, be antagonistic. So that's a very interesting line of thought. And more generally, we are going through a crisis of the universalist model, particularly in France here, but we see the same thing in other Western democracies as well. It's being contested on the one hand by those who consider that this universalist model does not guarantee equality and inclusion. And on the other hand, we've got those who consider that there is too much diversity, and that diversity is fragmenting the national community, leading to separatism, as we mentioned in the introduction. So, given this framework, the legitimate players are not going to be the same depending on which country you're in. In France, we'd say that the state is legitimate in this role, above all, whereas in the United States or in the UK, there are many things which are driven by companies and company groupings. That doesn't mean that businesses in France aren't doing anything, but in terms of political culture, the profiles are very, very different. And one of the problems that we have here in France is that we are going through a crisis of government efficacy. And it's all linked to public finances, but that's not the only factor. And that is surely why the problem of the fragmentation of our country is becoming such a major and pressing issue today. Thank you very much, everybody.